Happy pre-Interdependence Day. So it's a wonderful opportunity on this day to share some thoughts on not just moral suffering. It's just this is kind of heavy, but also on integrity at a time when many of us are really examining what integrity means in terms of our social, political, and economic landscape, how the Dharma grounds integrity, and when integrity is violated, how we suffer morally. And I wanted to actually begin with a short piece from my book, Standing at the Edge, because I feel it reflects a perspective on integrity that's interesting. I say, I'm not a moral philosopher. Even so, investigating the nature of integrity and morality has been an important part of my practice and my life. In my work as an anthropologist, I discovered that there are many moral platforms, and that notions of what is right and wrong vary from culture to culture, even from person to person. Yet Buddhism gave me a new way to understand integrity, one that looks through the lens of suffering. When we cause suffering to others or ourselves, our integrity is violated. When we alleviate the suffering of others, our integrity is affirmed. It's pretty basic. When we cause suffering to others or ourselves, our integrity is violated. And when we alleviate the suffering of others, our integrity is affirmed. To have integrity is to have a conscious commitment to honor strong moral and ethical principles. The words morality and ethics have various definitions. Throughout this exploration of integrity, however, morality will refer to our personal values related to dignity, honor, respect, and care. Ethics will refer to the codified sets of beneficial and constructive principles that guide society and institutions and to which we are held accountable. Our values are reflected in our character and are what affirm or destroy our integrity. Without integrity, our freedom is compromised. Without integrity, our freedom is compromised. I've seen that integrity can have a fragile edge, perhaps more fragile than that of other edge states. By this, I mean that it often takes an experience of moral anguish, a push, a slip, or a tumble over the edge into the chasm of suffering to affirm or reveal our integrity. And that is why most of the stories I share about integrity include a component of suffering. These stories emphasize moral sensitivity, our ability to detect moral conflicts and dilemmas, and moral discernment, our ability to assess which actions are morally justified. They also include large doses of moral nerve, a term used by the author Joan Didion to describe someone who has non-negotiable virtue when standing on the abyss of harm. Okay. I think that's pretty strong and pretty clear. So I did not anticipate giving the Dharma talk tonight. I just got back from Australia and am completely discombobulated between jet lag and the intensity and profundity of spending a week with 800 women and a few men, mostly from Asia, most of whom were nuns, were monastic, many of whom have been subjected to egregious abuse and have stayed deep in their commitment to the Dharma in spite of all they have been through. And I have to say, I've been to maybe hundreds of conferences in my life, and this one meant more to me than any other gathering of people that I've ever experienced. It was extraordinary to be with women from all of the Buddhist schools, to be with women who were from so many different sects of Buddhism, to be with women, some of whom were very young, some of whom were very elderly, many of whom were not conventionally educated, some of whom were geshes, which is completely new. That is, doctorates in Tibetan studies, holding doctorates in Tibetan studies. Many of whom had broken glass ceilings, so to speak. Some of whom were head of big monastic environments. Many of whom who were fighting for social and environmental issues that really make a difference today. There was an absence of chitch, if you know what I'm saying. There was an absence of conventional politics. So often when people get together, particularly Buddhists, there is this kind of pulling and there's this sort of territorial impulse. But here, there was none of that. The Tibetans were going to the Korean kimchi class. The Koreans were going to the Vietnamese chanting. I mean, the whole thing was so rich and so diverse, and it was kind of exhausting. But it was brave. And by brave, I really mean brave. Let me just mention a few of the topics that were discussed, and there were many. When the Bhutanese nun stood up and gave a presentation on the sexual abuse of nuns, you could have picked 800 of us off the floor. She had statistics. She had interviews. It was an uncompromising and brilliant presentation. When ex-students of Sogyal Rinpoche stood up, and these were plenary sessions, and called him out around physical and sexual abuse, the whole room stood still. When Dekila Chunyalpa, who is a brilliant conservationist who has been here at Zen Brain at the Varela Symposium and is coming for chaplaincy to talk about environmental chaplaincy, spoke about our climate crisis and the realization that our climate crisis is completely interdependent with our economic system, our political system, gender bias, and war. Presentation after presentation brought to the attention of this nearly 1,000 women how important it is that we understand the nature of our personal suffering, of our interpersonal suffering, and get over it, and become social movers and work for the transformation of Buddhism in our time. It was very, very strong for me. It was a sharing of personal courage, but not just courage. It was a sharing that was based on women's capacity to be resilient. I know there was a lot of trauma in the room, but when Venerable Dandal and when the people from Sogyo Rinpoche Sangha gave their presentations, when slavery, female slavery, was addressed, when issues related to ordination not being accessible to women for decades, millennia actually, not decades, and now is just opening up. I know there was a lot of trauma in that room, but what you felt also was resilience. The absence of whining in that room was extraordinary. The absence of blame, and I don't know if any of you saw the clip of this Afro-American woman who had asked someone to come, to her house to probably repair something. And the guy arrived with a big Confederate flag on the back of his truck. Did you see that? It is really fascinating. And in a completely blameless way, she excuses him and politely dismisses him, de-escalating the hostility that he was anticipating. It takes phenomenal courage not to drop into blame, not to be caught in the grip of moral outrage, not to play the victim's card and becoming the perpetrator, but to hold people accountable in the way that Martin Luther King spoke about, bringing justice and love together. When we consider what's happening in our world today, to our oceans, to our earth, to our agricultural systems, to our aquifers. Today, someone spoke to me about fracking in New Mexico, which has a devastating effect on aquifers, poisoning aquifers, to the persistent pollutants that are in our air, in our earth, and in our water. Me often visiting Japan, but just driving down from the refuge today and seeing Los Alamos, etched those white buildings on the Pajarito Plateau, and considering the extraordinary danger we are in, not just in relation to nuclear proliferation in Saudi Arabia and Iran, but North Korea and mostly our country, with this renegade who's our current you-know-what. I'm not as good as that Afro-American woman, I tell you. I actually posted a little tweet this afternoon praying for intense rain in Washington, D.C. over the weekend. That's how mischievous I am. But being in Japan and aware that Fukushima is not done, that thousands of gallons of radioactive wastewater is being discharged into our ocean, looking at the increase of population year by year, looking at the presence of war and of climate catastrophe, where there are 68 million refugees from violence and the climate catastrophe. And recognizing that we are well into the 6th extinction of species on this earth. We have a lot to be brokenhearted about, including racism and sexism and an unjust, exploitative, crushing economic system. But what I realized during the Sakyadhita meeting, and I think many of us understand, that these are symptoms to a deeper malaise that is recognized in our Buddhist world. And that malaise relates to the 3 root poisons of greed, of a world of so many hungry ghosts that we even call Earth's gifts resources for us to exploit. Hatred, our nationalism, our tribalism, things moving inexorably, but hopefully not ultimately, way right. Being in Australia and hearing so many Australians talk about the parallels between Australia and the United States and other countries where the political machine is turning away from goodness. And we have to understand, again, that 3rd poison, the 3rd poison of delusion, of ignorance, of denial. And to understand also our part and the roots of our privilege. And yet, it's pretty amazing what is going on also at this time. Paul Hawken, in his book, Blessed Unrest, said, "It's the first time in history that a movement of such scale and breadth has arisen from within every country, city, and culture in the world, with no leader, rule book, or central headquarter." It's really fascinating to see how this subtler but most powerful expression of democracy is emerging through the works of thousands upon thousands of NGOs and millions of people, including in a place as fraught and corrupt as Nepal, where I spend my fall, to see the inspiration of young people in that country manifesting fundamental resilience in turning through the Dharma back to their villages and bringing apple trees, nut trees, health care, and political awareness, and pushing for gender balance. Hawkins goes on to say, "It is vast, and the issues broadly defined as social justice and environment are not separate issues at all." And Hawkins sees this movement as the kind of immune response. I think it's a really powerful metaphor. Upaya is an immune response to injustice, to greed, hatred, and delusion. You are an immune response to greed, hatred, and delusion. An immune response of humanity arising as if spontaneously to protect us and the planet from the forces that are despoiling our world. The organizations that compose it are social antibodies, attaching themselves to the pathologies of power. I just want to read that again, okay? Hawken just nailed it. The organizations, and I would say individuals that compose it, are social antibodies attaching themselves to the pathologies of power. Gorgeous. So I wrote this book in part standing at the edge, finding freedom where fear and courage meet, in part because I, as a social activist and as a Buddhist practitioner, I made so many mistakes and felt awful a lot of my life. Partly because of the gender situation that is mostly global, where women are always told they are not enough. They're not good enough, skinny enough, smart enough, powerful enough, strong enough, and so forth. And I really feel that as someone who's shortly going to turn 77, because I've been through lots of eras and errors, so to speak. And I, in this book, describe what are called edge states. And I called them edge states because I've discovered that every difficulty that I've had and the difficulties that I have borne witness to, whether they were the difficulties of my teachers or my students or my friends, or people in positions of authority and responsibility who have confided in me, or caregivers, or parents, have spoken deeply about the suffering that they've encountered and what they've learned from that suffering. And maybe in kind of popular psychology, one could call it positive disintegration. Nice. For me, I called it edge states. What is it to stand on the high edge of a strength, of a human virtue, and to fall off that edge? Whether that edge is altruism, or empathy, or integrity, or respect, or engagement, how we actually engage with life as it is. And tonight I'd like to speak briefly about the edge state of integrity. And in the introduction to that section in my book, I point to the fact that one of the powerful things around exploring integrity is to discover that some of the individuals who for us exemplify the deepest kind of integrity have fallen over the edge of it badly. I remember once I was moderating a session with Archbishop Tutu and His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And Archbishop Tutu said of Nelson Mandela, he really lacked empathy until he went to prison. I couldn't breathe when he said that. I found that so completely powerful, so totally illuminating. Or I recall the life of Fannie Lou Hamer, who was part of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee during the 1960s, who came from a family of sharecroppers and herself was a sharecropper. And when I met her in 1964, she told the story of going into a hospital for surgery and being sterilized in that hospital. And she realized that This was policy, basically, to sterilize Afro-American women in the state of Mississippi, if at all possible. And as a result, and she was a powerful church woman, she became part of the civil rights movement. And I met her as being part of SNCC, it was called SNCC, S-N-C-C, myself, listening to her story, also being fired from her sharecropper's job, being also thrown into jail and beaten near to death. And she said, faith is what keeps showing up for me. It is out of faith that I am working for social justice, for human rights. But facing incredible suffering herself, and also what is called moral distress, that is seeing the injustice in the world so clearly, being subject to that injustice in terms of direct violence on herself, and then coming to a place where she actually was a candidate for President of the United States. That was resilience, and it is what Joan Didion calls moral nerve. She stood in her principles against all odds, and she stood more strongly every year that I knew her. So I'd like to speak a little bit about moral suffering, because I feel that many of us are in the grip of moral suffering today. I noticed, for example, on the airplane when all this plastic, everything is wrapped in plastic, and I suddenly felt, thinking about our oceans filled with plastic. There is more plastic in our oceans than there are sea creatures. When I went to Starbucks to get a cool drink and realized I needed a straw to drink it, I had this moment where I had this kind of tinge of moral suffering, a plastic straw. When I see lights on that don't have to be on the Upaya campus, I have this kind of experience, not just of moral suffering, but specifically moral distress. In other words, I know that if we educate people better, our guests and friends who come to Upaya, that turning off the lights when they leave a room, turning a heater off in the winter, these are drops in an ocean, but they are drops. And it means us going upstream and educating the people who come through our temple doors at a level of conscientiousness that is much more granular than most of us who enjoy the privilege of the lives we live. So moral distress is when you experience distress, when there is a trespass of our values, when we see harm being caused, and we actually see a pathway through, but we cannot affect that path. We cannot follow that path because the forces that control the world make it impossible for us to do so. And one of the great antidotes to moral distress really happens through the granularity of our lives. Even though distress can arise, also, we can do our small part. I know Maya takes a train to Los Angeles instead of a plane. Less carbon in the air. Me, I feel like the light police, if you know what I'm saying. when too much plastic comes into my field, I allow myself to feel moral distress because I don't want to become unaware of how this contributes to suffering. And though the Japanese have a wonderful expression about this, mono non aware, the slender sadness, we don't want to ride just on the slender sadness only. We want the sadness to actually initialize us, to inspire us, to take action in the granularity, in the threads of our lives, to be a force for good, no matter how intimate, no matter how small. I think this is one of the things that the Buddha taught. I think that the Buddha experienced moral suffering when he went to visit some of his monks, and one monk, his body was covered in sores, he was laying on the floor, the body was stinking, and the monks were all doing prayers and praising the Buddha, and the Buddha was grossed out. Not because of the suppurating sores, but because the monks didn't take care of that human being who was suffering. And the Buddha sent his close monastics out to get fresh clothes, and he bathed the body of Tissa, of this one who was afflicted. And then he reprimanded his monks. Taking care of the body of one sick person is taking care of the Buddha. Maybe we can't make a hospital. Maybe we cannot found a hospice. But taking care of your mother and father is bathing the body of the Buddha. Moral distress. In fact, it is healthy for us to experience moral distress to a point, not when we succumb and are overwhelmed and move into futility, but so we feel that pinch of helplessness and we have the energy to take a step forward toward the good in the world without attachment to outcome. The second area that I've identified in terms of moral suffering is moral injury. And I think many of us experience moral injury today. Traveling internationally, being a voice for the Dharma in some small way, I'm still identified as an American. I'm the American whose country has as its southern border a real or a gun-controlled wall that makes it impossible for people fleeing from the violence that we actually have fomented to find refuge. And they themselves are thrown into cages. We should feel moral distress, but we should also feel moral injury. This is our country. These are our policies. We are identified with these actions. And the sense of shame that I experience as an American traveling in other countries and teaching the Dharma, knowing that people from nationalities that include Africa, Central America, South America, cannot come and be welcomed as my ancestors were, fleeing political and religious oppression, but are treated like animals, disparaged and disrespected. So we should feel moral injury, a sense of shame and blame, and to educate ourselves about the upstream causes that have given rise to these effects, and take action to transform the systems that create the structural violence and the direct violence that we are currently in at this time. And that violence is also feeding the climate catastrophe. Now, moral injury has been documented primarily by the experience of those in the military. One deployment can do it. Multiples can almost guarantee it. And moral injury leads often to addiction. And if you look at the suicide rate among military personnel, you realize, moral injury. But I would suggest that moral injury is present for teachers in our educational system, particularly No Child Left Behind, or our private, highly endowed school system, or our medical system, which is being technologized and where the relationship between patients and clinicians is more and more distal every day. And we don't even have to speak about our political system. We're aware. So I would suggest that it is important to actually experience the landscape of moral injury today, but not to let it overwhelm us, but let it be an engine for our commitment to end the policies and behaviors that are fueling the current situation, giving rise to such egregious suffering, horrifying suffering, the downstream effect of which on these children is horrible to consider. Moral outrage is another landscape of moral suffering that I've looked at. And I want to say, this is my favorite landscape. I love being self-righteous. If you know what I'm saying. And I'm sure some of you do too. And yet, you know what's so interesting? Understanding that moral outrage, which is a combination of anger, which arises from a sense of helplessness, and disgust, where our survival and our integrity is being violated. So when you do the neural analysis, the analysis of the neural networks associated with moral outrage, those networks are associated with anger, but also disgust. And recently I saw a little interaction between the Dalai Lama and educators, and it was very interesting. It was like, you know, I'm sort of ambivalent about moral outrage because it involves so much shaming and blaming, calling out, if you will. And it can be chronic. And I love what Rebecca Solnit calls it, among liberals particularly. She calls it recreational bitterness. It's a wonderful term. And yet, His Holiness the Dalai Lama made a very interesting observation. And I think that Thich Nhat Hanh, when I was practicing with him around 30 years ago, he recognized the same. That is, the right dose of moral outrage is important because it calls others to account if done skillfully. And it also fires the engine of commitment to transform the conditions that are engaged with harm, moral outrage. But then, you know, I have friends, and sometimes if I'm really tired, I get there myself. It's this kind of low-level moral outrage that's constantly sort of in a low-level way dissing, complaining, and whining. And I don't think that's what His Holiness was talking about, in fact. But falling into the grip of chronic moral outrage does no one any good. And the last landscape that I want to mention, because we're kind of coming to the end, I went to see with Dolpo Rinpoche when he was here a few years ago, the film about James Baldwin called I'm Not Your Negro. And Adolfo Rinpoche is so sweet. He didn't know about racism. He actually doesn't realize he's subject to racism himself, not his racism, but being racially profiled himself as a person, very small person, coming from the highlands of Dolpo. And he sat in the film completely fascinated, and we were next to each other, and Noah was on the other side. And when Baldwin used a term, I went electric. And the term was moral apathy. What bubbles and bypassing are we engaged in that turn us away from the first noble truth, the truth of suffering? The Buddha made it number one, not 2, 3, or 4. He just nailed it. Having the first noble truth, being the truth of suffering, tells us that we should turn toward the truth of suffering. We must see it, not flee it. We must see it, not flee it. Our bubbles of privilege, our addictions, even to lifestyle, our bypassing through relationship, through our practices, even through moral outrage, bypassing by being, if you will, a constant complainer, all take us away from the bigger and deeper picture of the truth of suffering. So I want to finish this little talk tonight. I recently read a wonderful graduation talk given by Cornel West to the 2019 class at Harvard Divinity School. And he is so cool. And I'm just going to do a summary. He said, first, hold on to your version of subversive piety. Piety has nothing to do with uncritical deference to dogma or blind obedience to doctrine. It has the mature recognition of the degree to which you are dependent on those who came before, and you remaining attuned to the source of good in your brief trek from womb to tomb. To be able to hold on to the best of the past, given that the past is so much of a wreckage, so much of a ruin, and yet still has something to give you. And then he says, hold on to your existential humility. And that is so rare and scarce these days because we have such a toxic, masculinist conception of what it is to be strong and hard and phallocentric. Oh, wow. Thank God, said Cornel West to the 2019 graduating class of Harvard Divinity School, for the Me Too movement. Not just to humble we brothers, not just to keep us accountable, but to get us in contact with the best of our humanity, given the patriarchal socialization that has been so hegemonic. Then he goes on, never, ever forget that you have the capacity to preserve your revolutionary joy. Yes. I mean, futility is not a good option. We live in a culture with a joyless quest for insatiable pleasure. Whole lot of titillation and stimulation possible, but when it comes to that which endures, the deep stuff, the joys that are beneath the pleasures, don't let anything or anybody take your joy away. I told the undergraduate class at the Black graduation yesterday, I said, don't let anybody take your funk away. They want to deodorize you and sanitize you and sterilize you and make you just another example of Harvard graduate and success. No, don't confuse success with greatness. Finally, as you embark on the next stage, fail so much the better. Fail with all your revolutionary joy. Fail with subversive piety. Fail with your intellectual humility and with your spiritual intensity. And then he says, let me know. Are you ready? Are you ready? Are you ready? Then let's go. Let's go. Thank you.